Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here. Yeah, Pour Demain is a think tank working in mostly Brussels in the EU on AI regulation and with a mission of having responsible deployment of general purpose AI models. So this event topic of optimizing base models for responsible progress really couldn't be any more fitting. And I just want to start by saying thank you so much for the opportunity. Great to see so many names in the audience, a lot of familiar ones. Um, at the very end of your presentation, Conrad, you mentioned how would governments evaluate whether the use of these models are safe. So hopefully my presentation can shed a little bit of light on that question, and also where does accountability lie. And also, Vincent, I look forward to the workshop in Paris. I hope to be there. Yeah, so let me get started. So today I'm going to talk about the Code of Practice, which is a section of the EU's AI Act. So this is a regulation that was brought in about 2 years ago by the EU, one of the first in the world, and it has two sections broadly. And of course, these definitions are somewhat imperfect because legal definitions fitting onto technological definitions are not always perfect. But the AI Act splits into AI systems and AI general purpose AI models. And I'm going to be talking about the general purpose AI models. This means the upstream, just the weights of the model, which are then often backing AI systems downstream. But I'm just going to be talking about general purpose AI models upstream, which is more relevant for this presentation on optimizing base models for responsible progress, because it's really about the base model. So the code of practice is basically the details of how the very vague rules in the AI Act on general purpose AI models will actually be put in practice. And it's basically a long list of one way of complying with the GPI rules. In that way, it's voluntary because you could comply with the law in other ways, but this is really like the way that the EU and specifically the European Commission and the AI Office has decided is the best way to comply. So it is voluntary, but basically all majority providers have signed on. So OpenAI has signed on, Anthropic has signed on, Google DeepMind, XAI to one of the chapters. So it has kind of broad industry consensus. It's covering three chapters. So starting with transparency, this means it's important for the model providers to provide summaries of their training data. Some would argue that this is not strong enough, that basically the fact that they can summarize training data and not give very detailed information on what they've trained on is an issue. It also, in the transparency section, you need to provide a lot of information for your downstream actors. So if somebody is using your model downstream, they need to know a little bit about what kind of testing was done on it, what it was trained on, and what are like expected use cases and functionalities. There's also a copyright section. This was highly controversial, of course, politically, but also for many of the stakeholders involved. I won't be talking so much about that because it's not my expertise. But there's also a third safety and security section. This has been our focus, and this is only for really the largest models. So the way that the AI Act defines general purpose AI models with systemic risk. I see I'm cutting up a little bit, but you can still hear me?
I
Yes.
can still
Okay.
still hear you.
Great. So the threshold for systemic risk in the AI Act is, again, an imperfect one, but it's what was the best thing at the time, which is a compute threshold that sits at 10 to the 25 floating operation points. So this is really the biggest models in the world. Above this threshold right now are really recent model releases like Gemini 3, Grok 4, and also GPT 4.5. So this applies to these models will have to comply with the safety and security section. Now, the risks that the code of practice looks at are really these frontier risks. So there's a taxonomy of about 4 mandatory risks and some that are unfortunately not mandatory, but you have to justify why you have left those out. So some of the mandatory risks include cyber offensive capabilities. We know that AI models are getting really good at cyber offense. CBRN, which stands for chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. So basically AI models' ability to produce, for example, a bioweapon. But there's also manipulation, so whether it can manipulate users, produce disinformation at scale. There's also one that's not mandatory is threats to fundamental rights. This is basically you have to justify why your model doesn't create these risks, but you don't. Once you've done that, you don't have to test for them, which is unfortunate. And also, finally, loss of control, which is whether the model is displaying deceptive characteristics or, for example, doing things like sandbagging, noticing that it's in an evaluation environment and for example, lowering its capabilities strategically or something like that. Now, I just want to bring this back into the reality that these risks in the taxonomy maybe a few years ago seemed quite theoretical, but increasingly they are becoming more and more real. So, for example, on the topic of manipulation, we've seen lots of headlines from chatbots being involved in really deeply personal conversations with people, and in very unfortunate cases, sometimes even leading to the encouragement of self-harm and even suicide. So this is a key example of manipulation. There's also been recorded proliferation of AI-driven psychosis from interactions with chatbots. We've also seen the evidence of disinformation campaigns having real effects. So manipulation is real. And then the second one I want to talk about is cyber offensive capabilities. This is one that model providers have been more and more sort of sounding the alarm bells about, that these models are getting really good at coding, basically, which also means they're really good at cyber offense. And recently, only a few weeks ago, Anthropic, with their model Claude, uncovered a successful cyber offensive campaign carried out using their Claude models, and this campaign, which they said had links to Chinese state actors controlling the companies that were involved. They breached a number of US companies, tech companies, banks, a chemical manufacturer, and government agencies. And the point of this is that AI completed 80 to 90% of the steps. And the way it was used was through a quite simple jailbreak of it was instructed to carry out defensive capabilities, and these abilities were then manipulated into having it autonomously carry out cyber offensive capabilities. So this is just to say that these things are happening in the real world, and the code of practice is there to try and defend against them, to try and have these companies do proper risk mitigation to make sure that their models can't actually do these things, or when they can, that the right safety guardrails are in place. So quickly, what does the code do? It provides a lot of transparency for downstream players, as I mentioned, but in the safety and security chapter, it outlines how you should do the sort of basic risk mitigation suite, risk management that appears in all kinds of industries before AI, stuff like risk identification, risk assessment, risk mitigation. It has very clear cybersecurity requirements. So how do you ensure that your model is not stolen by an adverse actor? Very importantly, it contains provisions for evaluations. So right now, one of the main ways to kind of test the safety of a model, which is extremely crude and will not work in the long run, is basically to do black box evaluations. So essentially to ask it if it's safe. In the code of practice, this is required, but luckily it goes a bit beyond that. So evaluations need to be state of the art. We know that increasingly the state of the art of evaluations is that they can be more deep. They can have more access to the model, not just a black box, but access to more deeper parts of the model. This isn't perfect. There is no solution to interpretability yet, but the code of practice basically insists that this has to happen at the state of the art of what researchers are doing, what different AI companies are doing, and what is seen as best practices. Importantly, also, this evaluation will be done by third parties. So this is something that hasn't happened yet before these rules came in. There are a number of companies popping up that are getting really good at, for example, evaluating models for their bio capabilities or cyber capabilities. And the fact that this happens externally by a third party in some sort of auditing relationship is a really positive step, because this has really not been the case in the tech industry, whereas it's a standard practice in things like finance, food safety, all kinds of product safety. There's also serious incident reporting, stuff like systemic risk responsibility allocation. So again, very established in safety critical sectors that you have, for example, a chief risk officer, somebody who's really responsible for these safety issues. This was not the case at companies developing frontier AI models, and after the code of practice, it will be. And also, there is some public transparency, unfortunately, not enough. So, one of the issues is that a lot of documentation, a lot of safety reporting will go to the regulator, in this case, the AI Office of the European Commission. But very little is actually going to be disseminated to the public, which is a shame because it creates this informational asymmetry where researchers and the wider community doesn't know exactly what's going on here. There are a lot of sort of provisions in the code of practice that allow this public transparency to be quite minimal. So frontier safety frameworks or model cards, which are basically released with models to say what kind of safety testing was done. These can be summarized, these can be redacted. So this is a shame. Now, of course, I want to make a comment that, you know, when in the EU, when you talk about regulation, sometimes people say, well, doesn't the EU regulate too much? Doesn't the EU regulate just before AI even exists? Now, some things that are really positive about the Code of Practice and the AI Act is that it's really proportional. So it only applies to companies deploying really big models. So these are really big companies, basically. They have quite sufficient budgets for this kind of compliance. And the code of practice is also based on things that they were more or less doing before, but this just standardizes it. It really provides a lot of legal certainty to the smaller companies that are downstream, that are basically subject to whatever's happening upstream. And this is going a bit to what Conrad said, that where does the accountability lie? In this case, it's really upstream where the companies know the most about what's going on. They know what kind of data the models were trained on, and they are best placed to deal with the risks. So yeah, in terms of sovereignty as well, this is a really important point in the EU, especially as transatlantic relations are deteriorating compared to previously. That in the interim, before the EU's tech stack is more sovereign, if enforcement of these kind of rules are done right, then at least the risks of less sovereignty will be mitigated by targeted rules. So basically, it's to say that foreign companies cannot do anything that they like in the EU market, and this is a good thing for sovereignty. I briefly want to touch on the fact that there has already been some signs of a Brussels effect from these rules. So this Brussels effect meaning that sometimes rules and norms for safety and fundamental rights and ethics are sometimes created in Europe, and then these spread elsewhere. And this was kind of coined around the GDPR and data privacy in general. So with regarding frontier AI regulation, some similar regulations have popped up in certain states in the US. So California recently passed a law called SB 53, which is very similar to the Code of Practice, and New York is in the final stages of finishing a law called RAISE, which is also quite similar. Not the Code of Practice, but similar to the AI Act. Very, very good work has been done by Canada, South Korea, and Brazil, moving in similar steps. So just lastly, finally, in terms of next steps, the newly set up AI office has a really big job on their hands as the regulator of these frontier models. And they need to enforce the rules starting now with penalties potentially coming in next year. And this combined with the EU's ambitious strategy to accelerate AI development in Europe, because of course they don't want to just regulate it, but they also want to kind of do AI well as well. This will be a good combination to make sure that there are rules to make it safe and reliable, but also the EU is pursuing its own ambitious AI strategy. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks a lot, and I hope that was helpful.